Alright, so up next we're going to take a look at all of your tracks, and I'm going to break down how to change the displays on these tracks and what everything is in terms of audio routing and functionality. So if you're looking at your tracks and they don't look how they look on my screen, there's these 4 buttons with letters on them. There's I, O, R, M, and D, and all of those buttons just change the display of your tracks. So if I take off I/O, you'll see we got rid of our inputs and outputs. If I get rid of R, you get rid of your returns. And if I hit M, we get rid of our mixer controls. And if I hit D, then I can see delay in milliseconds. So this allows you to add a delay to your tracks. So say you want something to rush or drag, you can add millisecond delays. You want to enable your IOs, our returns, our mixer, and in this case we could leave the delay compensation off. At any point you could right click and insert audio or MIDI tracks or return tracks, or group them. So a quick rundown: there's MIDI tracks and there is audio tracks. Your MIDI tracks will be what you use to use any virtual instruments, and audio tracks handle any audio recordings that you're going to do. First off, if we're starting at the top left here, you have these little drop down triangles which allow you to collapse tracks or expand them. You could also hold Alt and click and it'll collapse them all or expand them all. You could also click and drag in between tracks to individually change their sizes. You could also Alt, click, and drag, and you'll also adjust the size of all of them. Renaming tracks is Command R. So next to the track names, we have some options and drop downs here. For MIDI tracks, that's going to be where you can select which MIDI keyboards are triggering which tracks. So for instance, if I want only a computer keyboard to trigger this MIDI track, and say Volt 2 is a MIDI keyboard as well, I can record both simultaneously by enabling both, and only my computer keystrokes will trigger this track and only the Volt would trigger this track. The drop down beneath that can be used to route complicated drum racks and things like that. It's not a menu that I use very frequently, but just know that it's there. So underneath that you have input monitoring, an auto monitoring, and you can turn monitoring off. In terms of MIDI, you may not use this too much, but there might be cases where you could. This comes more in handy for audio tracks. Let's say I had a mic, for example, track 1 here, I could see some metering. So if I hit input, I should be able to hear and see how much level is coming through. And that way, if you're recording someone and they want to hear themselves, you can do that. Alright, so the auto monitoring button has a lot of different functionality. For example, you can see right now it is monitoring. I should be able to hear myself here, but if I switch to a different track, you can see it'll stop monitoring here. So just know you need to record enable there, and then when you record audio, you'll be able to hear yourself, but anytime that audio is playing back, you won't be able to monitor. So if I record something here, it would be a standard recording where I can hear myself and perform as I want. If I stop the recording then and I'm playing stuff back, so if I record it won't monitor when there's audio content on the timeline, but after the audio content, then it'll start monitoring again. So next to that, you have the off button, and that just turns off input monitoring, so you wouldn't be able to hear yourself. Some people don't like to hear themselves when they record, so that's the button you would click for that. Underneath that, you have your output routing. So in this case, it's for an audio track. I can make this a sends only track. I could route this audio to another track. So say I wanted to record the audio from 4 to audio 5 here. I could output the audio 4 to audio 5. I could hit record here and it'll record what's on audio 4 to audio 5. So that's how that works. So MIDI tracks also have an output, however they require an audio track or another track to have some sort of MIDI based effect. So here I loaded on this audio 5 a instance of Harmony Engine. This is a harmonizer that can take input MIDI. So if I switch here to record via MIDI, it'll generate different voices based on MIDI. So if I had some chords here, then I can route this MIDI to trigger the voices in audio 5 by going to the output of the MIDI, clicking audio 5. You can see it drops down 4 voices here. Depending on what plugin you're using, you may need to route some of these things. Alternatively, Ableton has a stock plugin called External Instrument that allows you to basically output MIDI just as you would there, except for without having to change anything there. So same thing though, you need to have a plugin with a MIDI based functionality. So moving on, we have these orange buttons here. That is to enable and disable tracks. So I can mute tracks by clicking here or enable tracks by clicking them on. So as long as they're yellow, they are active, and if they are grayed out, they are inactive. This button can also be automated. It's a great way to cut off reverb tails and things like that by muting the whole track. So any effects that would come out through the master would be completely muted by automating this. So if you have just clicked it, you can hit A and it says speaker on here, and then I could take a small range. Click a range, holding shift and then dragging down the automation will make it behave like this. If you don't, when you click and drag, it kind of just makes a point. As you can see, because I automated it, it added a little red dot here. That's how you know if there is some automation going on with the mute button here. So continuing on here, there's this little blue box here that's used to change the volume of your clips, and you can click and drag here to increase or decrease volume. You could also double click here and type stuff. So say I want this to be -10 decibels. I can type -10 and then enter. And also I could select multiple tracks and say I want, well, this one's not showing a meter because there's no instrument on it, but as soon as I add one, you can see we have a volume meter. So say I grab all of these and I want to subtract 10 decibels from all of them. I could double click one of these and do -10, and you'll see that this one that I've already ducked down by 10 dB is going to be -20. And everything else -10. So that's a quick way to adjust volume of groups. So underneath the volume, you have these negative infinity boxes here. Those correspond to your sends. So as you can see, I have two sends, a reverb send and a delay send. The first box is going to correspond to my reverb, and the second box is going to correspond to my delay. So basically, a send is a track that's always active. Normally it'll have some sort of effect. So as these names suggest, this one's reverb and this one's delay. And what you're doing by increasing these faders is basically just floating in the effect from the reverb. So the audio will go from this track into my reverb, and then I can adjust how much of that volume and processing we're hearing with this fader. So let's take a look at an example with this serum patch. So as you can hear, that's dry. And then if I float in the reverb all the way to 0, now we have reverb. And you could adjust that to be subtle or extreme. Right next to that, this one would correspond to send B, which is going to be our delay. And so if we click it, you can see we have our delay here, and changing these values changes the rate at which it's delaying. And you can link them here with this button. Could adjust the feedback. So that's how those work. Next, you have the solo button and record button, self-explanatory there. And right here, this C is a panner. So C means that this track is centered. And as we go left, we have left panning, and then 50 to the right would be all the way to your right. So you could also double click here and type values. If you do negatives, say I do -25, that'll be left, and if you do positives, that'll be right. So that's a quick way to pan things, and I believe you can do multiple tracks at once. So I could type -25, and now it subtracted 25 from both values. You could also automate the panning. Pretty much anything here you could automate by clicking. However, it could get a little tricky when you start automating things, and I wouldn't recommend automating volume directly on here. Ableton has a stock plugin called Utility. If you apply automation to your main fader, you can't adjust the overall volume anymore without overriding the automation. With Utility, it allows you to add dynamics that you want in terms of volume, and then you still have the option to adjust the overall volume of that track. So I could click gain here, and I could automate volume that way. As you can see, I'm going to go down 13 dB and then come back up to 0. and I could still turn the overall level down. If I start doing automation to the actual volume, you can see I get that red dot, and when I start turning up volume, I lose my automation. And this is when that little orange button comes on, and you just have to re-click that to re-enable your automation. So at the bottom we have our returns, and the only real difference here is that you could change this to pre or post fader. Another really important feature is that you can group things. So say I want all this to be a section, I can hit Command G and that'll group it. And you could even create groups within groups. So if I want to make this a group, I can do that. And say I want to make this a group, I can do that. So let's say, for example, these were drums. I can make this group snares. I can make this hats. And I could even duplicate within and do kicks. And then I could just go ahead and just alt-click the group and it'll collapse it all. So one thing to note, when you add processing to a group, you are processing everything within those groups. And once again, you could also right-click these to change the colors. So if I change these individual groups to different shades of color, we can right-click those groups and assign the track color of the group to the tracks within the group. And if, for example, I was to assign track color to clips within the main group, I believe it'll change everything to that color. And lastly, we have our master. Anything you apply to the master track will apply those effects and processing to the entire song, so long as they're routed to the master. If you are doing tempo automation, that'll show up on your master. So I could right click show automation here, or just switch to A. You can see we have our song tempo here, and I could create markers to change the tempo. So just know that's where your master tempo is. And then here, this blue fader box allows you to change the volume of the metronome as well as the auditioning of samples within the browser. So if I'm going to turn this down, turn this headphone icon on. So that's at -8. This is at 0. So if I turn my metronome on here, and if I were to put this to -10, it'll get louder. And if I do 0, louder. And then the volume of the master controls the overall level of everything in your session as a whole. And you may have noticed how I am putting plugins onto tracks. You can just click a track, find a plugin that you'd like to add to it, and double click it, and it'll add to that track. And if I keep adding things, it'll just keep adding in the chain. You can also click and drag plugins to certain tracks. Since this is a VST instrument, it would go on a MIDI track. You could click and drag into audio tracks if you want EQs on certain tracks. You can do it this way. That's pretty much everything, but I'm going to give you a couple advanced tips with these tracks. Let's do it on this track here. You can right click and do show take lanes. You can see every take that I recorded is saved here, but you'll see if I record something, it adds it to another take without destroying previous takes. And anything that is highlighted will be the take that I'm using. And this is a great time to use the pencil tool. You could use the pencil tool to click and drag certain ranges, and as you can see, it's comping it for me. I can take little bits from here, little bits from there, and that's just a really quick way to comp things. Holding command allows you to slip off the grid and select specific non-quantized ranges. That's one very important feature of Ableton, and the second would be your automation lanes. If I hit A here, you can see these two drop downs correspond to what you're automating. So in this case, it's the utility and it's the gain, and you could click on different parameters you want to automate, and you could even add lanes. So say I want to do some mono switching or something, I can do that, and then I could add more lanes, and you could add as many lanes of automation as you want.